Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got two experts on tariffs and trade with us tonight from Miller Thomson, and I thought that it would be really helpful for us to take a look at what happened last week with the Trump reciprocal tariffs and try to understand it with some legal experts, but then also try to figure out what all of us that are running businesses or in our personal lives should be doing. Colleen Ma is joined us. She's a partner with Miller Thomson in Calgary. She's the lead of the firm's national sales, commodity, and indirect tax team. And also I've got Louis Amato-Gauci, and he is a partner with Miller Thomson in Toronto, and he's the co-lead of the firm's national transportation and logistics team and a member of its global trade and customs practice group. Both of you, thank you so much for joining. So let's just start with these reciprocal tariffs. He stood up in the Rose Garden. He had this big, a board, a plexiglass board, and he said that these were the tariffs. And I've heard all this controversy that these weren't the tariffs that other countries were actually charging. We always thought that, I think the way he represented it, that these were the tariffs that people were charging. And now we hear they're not. Can anyone explain what's going on here?
Well, it's really interesting because we heard so much, you're right, in the lead up to the announcement from the Rose Garden last week. We heard, for example, that the purpose was to address the trade imbalance between the United States and various countries. We heard that they were targeting things like tariffs and non-tariff barriers that other countries impose on U.S. imports. But we didn't see any of that at the end of the day. When you look at the numbers, it turns out that it's a much simpler calculation than many of us had expected. And simply, it appears to be you take the amount of the surplus, the trade surplus that a particular country has with the United States, and you divide that by the total exports from that country to the United States in 2024. And then you divide that number by half and you put it up on a chart, and there's your tariff. And the strange thing about this is that when you rank all of those tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs, from top to bottom, you'll see that it is very heavily weighted adverse to a number of lesser developed countries and developing countries, countries like Vietnam and Cambodia and others, and less heavy in the direction of countries like the United Kingdom and the European Union. So it's kind of an interesting situation. It's not what we were expecting. Frankly, it could have been a lot worse for Canada and Mexico in particular. Thankfully, it wasn't, at least for now.
Do you think it makes any sense?
It is a strange way of addressing the issues that were outlined as the purpose for those reciprocal tariffs. I'm not an economist. It's not what I do. But what I do try to do is to assist our clients to figure out, first of all, how does this impact what they're doing today? And what steps should they be taking to try to prosper and maybe even look for some opportunities that are buried in these changes that have been rolled out against the entire world from Washington.
So let's get to that in a second, but let's stay on this reciprocal tariffs for a second, if I could. So as an example, Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, which are two French colonies in the middle of the Gulf of the St. Lawrence, I understand have reciprocal tariffs of 50%, which means that the tariff must have started at 100%, I presume, to get to 50% after the fact. And my understanding is all they export to the United States is fish products. So it's, stuff they catch in the Gulf of St. Lawrence that they ship to the United States, and that they don't import that much from the United States because that they import from Canada, though there is some products that they import from the United States via Canada, but it didn't get counted in the calculation. And now all of a sudden that small amount of fish products that they export to the United States are going to be tariffed at 50%. How does that make sense? And how does that going to stem?
It's certainly not going to do very much to lower the price of eggs in the United States. And while the story in Saint-Pierre and Miquelon is interesting, it's unfortunate, I think, for those fishers in that part of North America and the impact that this is going to have potentially on their sales to the United States. there are so many other examples. You've got the example of Norfolk Island, which is populated with penguins. Now, it's possible that Washington knows something about those penguins that the rest of the world doesn't. But no, there are a lot of aspects to what we heard last Thursday that do not seem to make a lot of sense. What we do see, though, buried in all of that information coming out fast and furious from the White House at the latter part of last week, is the fact that as of right now, CUSMA, the Canada-US-Mexico Free Trade Agreement, is not dead. We've lost some of its benefits, but it is still alive today, which means for Canadian manufacturers and for the Canadian government, there are opportunities, I think, to find a way out of the situation that we currently find ourselves in with the United States.
Okay, so if Kuzma's not dead, even though he's applied tariffs for aluminum and steel and autos and parts and stuff like that, what's the way out that you're describing?
Well, first of all, I mean, we have to remember that that CUSMA is based on an amendment that was put into the agreement at the request of the United States. It's up for review by all three parties, and that must be completed by around this time next year. And if we get to the point where the three parties are no longer interested in carrying on with the agreement, it dies within 10 years. The reality is that right now, with the automobile tariffs that you referred to and the steel and aluminum tariffs, we've lost a lot of the benefits of CUSMA. It's true. But then on the other hand, we have been exempt from the so-called reciprocal tariffs that were rolled out last Thursday because, and that's only with regard to CUSMA originating goods. So if you're a Canadian manufacturer that is producing goods for export to the United States, if you take the time and effort to ensure that your goods actually qualify under the applicable rule of origin as CUSMA originating goods, many Canadian manufacturers have not done that. We can talk about why that is. Then for the time being, you continue to have the full benefit of that free trade agreement.
Okay, so explain to me if you could, if CUSMA is still alive, and they're respecting CUSMA, how did he put in place these significant tariffs on steel and aluminum? And again, why does this make sense? I understand that 90% of the aluminum produced in Quebec gets shipped to the United States, and that the United States is very dependent on aluminum from Quebec for Molson's beer, as an example.
We have to remember that in 2018, in Trump 1.0, the first administration of President Trump, when he introduced steel and aluminum tariffs, clearly the intention at that time was leverage in the case of Canada and Mexico, leverage leading up to the renegotiation of NAFTA to create what is now CUSMA. My hunch is that we're probably looking at very much the same set of rules here.
But Louis, if CUSMA exists, why does he have the right to do that? I disagreed with, but understood this whole fentanyl thing. He had the excuse, and so therefore he said it was an emergency. But how can you use fentanyl as an excuse, or what excuse did you come up with to put in place these huge tariffs on steel and aluminum and effectively devastate the Quebec aluminum business?
I agree. It's difficult. It's difficult to justify many of the things that we've seen coming out of the White House in the last couple of months. One important message here, though, which I hope is not lost on the administration in Washington, is the fact that if, in fact, the United States is turning its back on the global trading order as we've known it for the last 80 years, as it developed post-World War II through the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and the WTO and so on and so forth, if it's moving away from that in favor of bilateral agreements with countries, maybe in some cases multilateral agreements like CUSMA, what message is it sending to its potential trading partners and parties that it wishes to negotiate these agreements with if agreements can just be ignored? on a whim, seemingly, or because the wind has changed. So there are some major challenges here, I think, in some respects. The U.S. administration may have painted themselves into a bit of a corner. As far as Canada goes, though, look, we've
Isn't
been
there a
down this
line
road
about
before.
fool me once versus fool me twice?
Well, this is it. We've been down this road before. We've got a bit of a sense of how things work within this administration. It's some of the characters have changed. For example, we no longer have Ambassador Lighthizer, who had a particularly productive relationship with Chrystia Freeland during the renegotiation of NAFTA leading up to CUSMA. But we understand to some extent what drives this administration. For example, there's an overriding obsession with the trade imbalance that the United States has with the rest of the world. Well, I'm not an economist again, but there are in some respects concerns regarding the impact of a trade imbalance over a long period of time. Um, but this isn't the way to go about it. Those are my personal views, not necessarily the views of my firm. But nonetheless, I think the important thing here is we need to help our Canadian manufacturers, importers and exporters, figure out how's this affecting me right now? What do I need to do in order to continue to be compliant, notwithstanding all of the changes that are coming my way? Number one. Number two, what can I do to streamline everything in my supply chain so that I'm mitigating as best I can the impact of these new tariffs and these new regulatory challenges? And then number three, to look out for opportunities presented by the changes that have been introduced versus Canada, Mexico, and the rest of the world by the U.S. administration. And there I'm thinking
a good strategy and something that we should be paying attention to, every single small business, medium-sized business, large business in Canada. So
100%.
Thank you for that. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with our two guests from Miller Thomson talking about what we need to do to deal with Donald Trump and his tariffs. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting tonight with two experts, legal experts from the legal firm of Miller Thomson, Colleen Ma and her partner, Louis Amato-Gauci, Gauci, about tariffs, Trump's tariffs, reciprocal tariffs, and what's going on. Colleen, maybe I could turn to you. There's been a lot of controversy and questions and just, misunderstanding about who actually pays these duties. So maybe you could just give everyone an example of, if you were a manufacturer, and I understand you're in Calgary, if you were a manufacturer in Calgary, Alberta, or in southwestern Ontario, and you were shipping products to the United States, where does the tariff actually get paid? And a lot of the Democrats are saying, well, it's a tax, and a lot of the Republicans are saying, well, the foreigners are going to pay it. Who actually pays it, and when, and how?
Yeah, so it would be the importer that pays it, and those importers can be foreign businesses, but it also can be the domestic business, the domestic company. But I think ultimately, and of course, it's a business decision for that particular entity. Ultimately, I think a lot of these costs are going to be passed down to consumers.
So what happens? Like, you get stopped at the border and get given a bill? Like, what actually happens? Where does that duty get papered and charged?
Yeah, in Canada, it would get paid to CBSA. So at the time it's imported. And in Canada, there are programs where it can get paid after those goods are released. But sometimes it gets stopped at the border until those duties and other taxes are paid.
And so going into the United States, these reciprocal tariffs, or the 10% or the 25% on aluminum and steel, does Stelco pay it in Hamilton? Does Stelco pay it at the border? Does Stelco pay it in the United States? What happens?
It's a complicated system, and I think Louis is probably better positioned to speak to the details of that.
It's an interesting question because it's not going to be the same answer in every circumstance. It really depends on the trade agreements, the trade terms that you've agreed to with your customers. So within the trade industry, we use shorthand referred to as Incoterms, which are published by the International Chamber of Commerce to signify who's responsible for what in the sale and transport and importation, export from one country, import to the other, of the goods, including who is responsible for accounting for and paying those duties. So one of the first things that Canadian manufacturers should be doing is looking closely at their agreements with their customers and with their suppliers to see exactly what those trade terms are. What is the current arrangement for the payment of those tariffs? Of course, if you're the person who's on the hook, if you've agreed to account for and pay for those import duties, then your cost of doing business has just multiplied significantly in some cases. Now, what we are encouraging our clients to do is to sit down with their trading partners, whether it's a buyer, a customer on the one hand, or a supplier that they depend on for an input that's crucial to their manufacturing process, and be fully transparent with them about the situation. Show them the numbers, show them the impact that these new tariffs are going to have on their bottom line. Here's the thing, if you're, depending on the industry that you are active in, you may have gone through a very rigorous quality assurance program for the benefit of your customer. I'm thinking here of auto parts in particular and OEMs in the automotive industry. They're not going to be in a hurry to dump you as a trusted, reliable supplier and try to replace you. They may not be able to replace you, certainly not very quickly, without having to go through all of that due diligence all over again. So they have an incentive, and you may have a little bit more leverage than you think, to rebalance some of those trade terms. Now, you're not likely to be able to say, well, I'm not paying anything of these new tariffs. Well, then you might want to look at an exit from your agreement, which might be available to you through force majeure, although not likely, depending on how that clause is worded.
Explain to everyone listening, if you could, what's force majeure?
Force majeure is a concept that was initially a civil code concept, where if you're in a contract where it's suddenly become virtually impossible for you to perform your obligations, you may have an exit. The thing is, the way it's been interpreted by common law courts in the rest of Canada outside of Quebec, it's very narrowly construed. It's very narrowly construed. It's not as rigorous as a what we call frustration of the contract, but it's pretty close to I simply cannot perform and I need out.
Okay, so let me ask you a question. So, if an American company has a contract with a Canadian supplier to buy auto parts in your example, and all of a sudden now it's subject to a duty, but I've caught a contract that says I'm going to buy, $1 million a year of these auto parts that are all of a sudden going to be $1 million plus something more. And the tariff is something that I, as the importer, pays. Can I use force majeure to get out of that obligation to buy $1 million and pay $250,000 extra? You'd
have to very, very carefully review the wording of that clause.
Okay, and so let me take you a little bit farther, because a lot of these contracts, I understand, have exclusions in them that say that I don't have to, that the price doesn't have to be the same if it includes increased taxes. And some people are saying that increased taxes should be increased taxes and tariffs, and other people are saying, no, tariffs aren't taxes. So if there's a clause in an agreement that has an out for not having to pay for increased taxes, do you think that counts? Does tariff counts?
There's no one general answer that I can give you, Brian, because it depends on how those terms are interpreted for purposes of that agreement, depending on how the agreement's been drafted.
So I've gotten 3 contracts over the course of the last week where people have all added in and tariffs to that clause, the same clause that says that they don't have to take obligations for increased taxes, and they've added comma and tariffs.
When you say they've added, that must be something that they've negotiated with
No, they're
their
trying to negotiate.
contract counterpart. That's exactly what I'm talking about. So if you've got a little bit of leverage with your customer or your supplier, depending on which way we're going here, then yes, absolutely. You should be negotiating for price adjustment clauses. You should be trying to negotiate for some flexibility. It might be as simple as dropping in the word and tariffs or and tariffs and surtaxes into the definition of what constitutes a tax that allows for.
Okay, so tell me what's going to happen. What you're the smart lawyer. You're advising Canadian companies. You got an American purchaser buying auto parts, has $1 million obligation a year that's now gone up to what, $1,250,000.
Here's the thing.
What happens? Those two business people are sitting in a room, and all of a sudden this $1 million contract's gone up by 25%. What do they do?
Again, I think it's going to come down to the relationship between the parties, which is why I think honesty and transparency is a great place to start. You want to leverage the relationship that you've developed over the years with that customer or with that supplier, and demonstrate to them that if in fact you end up having to carry the full burden, then it may in fact be the end of that relationship, whether it's an exit from the contract or you're going to find yourself in restructuring.
Who can take
the more likely
who
thing?
Can
though,
take either a 25% reduction in my price, which means my profit disappears, or on the other side, who can take on a 25% increase in my price, which consumers aren't going to pay 25% more. So, how do you do that?
Look, these tariffs at the end of the day are a tax. There's no question about it. In some cases, it's going to be the manufacturer that bears some or all of that burden. In some cases, it's going to be their customer. And in most cases, ultimately, it's going to get passed down to the end user one way or another. We know this. And this is why this country in particular has been so focused on developing free trade relationships with the United States and then expanded from the United States to all of North America. And in fact, with 50 other countries around the world, including the European Union.
Yeah, but we've been talking about diversifying trade since,
Sure.
since I was born. And, we haven't done a lot of it. Colleen, in the clients that you've got, they must be calling you up and asking for advice. What are they doing?
Yeah, a lot of the questions are, what do we do? And it depends on the particular situation, what they do. And it depends on the relationships, like we said, with their suppliers or their customers. And from the tax perspective, what the key thing that I try to tell clients is, don't make a hasty decision, make a quick decision, but remember to take a step back and think about what else is this decision going to affect. Yes, the reason why you're re-looking at your agreement, renegotiating agreements that you may not have thought of you needed to renegotiate a year ago. When you look at those agreements, when you look at your negotiations, your relationships, maybe changing your business structure, you need to also think about what else it will impact. So my practice is mostly, what is your income tax impact? Is your rate going to change? Is your tax rate going to change on the sales tax side? Are you going to now have to charge sales tax when you didn't need to? Are you going to have to pay it when you didn't have to before? From a regulatory perspective, which I know is outside my area, but you need to think about, if you need other licenses, if you're going to be starting to carry on business in a different jurisdiction, what are the rules of that jurisdiction? So really what I'm telling clients is, whatever you do to address these tariffs, make sure you pause, think, and see what else is this going to impact, so you're not making a hasty decision that you're going to see negative effects in a few months or a few years if you get audited, for example.
Was your phone,
you have something to say too? Was
your phone running off the hook on Thursday and Friday after this Rose Garden announcement? It must have been.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of questions, a lot of what just happened. A lot of that was not expected, I think, as Louis said before, and what you said, Brian, as well. We were expecting these reciprocal, these tariffs to relate to trade barriers, some of the trade barriers that were identified originally by the White House included digital services tax, value added taxes, and the formula that the White House has used does not seem to reflect what was expected from those original announcements.
No, I'm really surprised by it. Go back to the European Union. The European Union, I understand, has an average tariff of 4%. And so therefore one would have thought that a reciprocal tariff that was half would have been 2%. And it ends up being 10%. And I just don't understand how you can justify when Europe is charging a tariff on average of 4%. Why wouldn't you just match that 4% or go with the 2%? Why would you possibly justify the 10%? And what that's going to do is that's going to mean that there's a whole bunch of European companies, companies don't have 10% bottom line margins, so they can't absorb that kind of tax for the foreign company. And I can't believe Americans are going to put up with a 10% increase in all of their wine and perfume and jewelry and all those things they're buying from Europe. So what's going to happen? Is trade just going to stop?
No,
Are we just going to have
trade is not going to stop. That's for sure. It's not going to stop. I mean, here what
so that's what you say, but I understand that American importers of wine and alcohol from Europe have just stopped making orders.
Well, at the same time, Ontario has stopped placing orders for liquor from the United States. We did that a while ago, and clearly it's having some effect because we see the senator from Kentucky as one of the sponsors of legislation seeking to take back the power that the president is purporting to use to roll out these emergency measures. Look, I think the important thing for Canadian manufacturers to focus on is this. You need to understand your industry, your products, your manufacturing process better now than you ever have. Up until a couple of months ago, it was fine for you to just coast because even if you didn't take the time and effort to see if your good in fact qualifies as CUSMA originating, the most preferred nation tariff, most favored nation tariff was nil or close to nil for exports to the US. That's no longer the case, right? And particularly hit hard here would be parts manufacturers and so on here in Ontario. You need to understand whether you've got the right tariff classification for your inputs at every level of the manufacturing process. Do you really know where each of those inputs originates? Can you confirm that you've got the right country of origin on all of your accounting with customs authorities in the United States and elsewhere? And is there anything that you're not doing correctly now with regard to the valuation of each of those inputs and the finished product? And you would be amazed at how often we see situations where a lot of these steps were either missed or they were accurate at one point, but they've not been revisited over the years. My advice to a Canadian manufacturer right now in this climate, particularly with new announcements and new tariffs and counter tariffs and responses coming from different countries, is you need to do that right now. If you haven't already, start taking stock of all of those very critical pieces of information. Create a library of your goods, part by part by part, and each of the relevant costs that goes into determining valuation for duty. And make sure that you're not leaving anything on the table. There may be adjustments to value for duty that you should have been taken advantage of all along, but haven't.
And I think that there's numerous companies that are doing that. And I think that we need to, after the break, understand this a little bit more, but that also where there's some easy changes they can make in sourcing some of their suppliers to make them domestic, to become CUSMA compliant. Let's take a break for some messages and come back with our two legal experts on tariffs and trades in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting tonight with two lawyers from Miller Thomson that specialize in trade, tax, tariffs, etc., and advising Canadian companies on what the blank to do, given what happened last week in the Rose Garden and these reciprocal tariffs from Donald Trump. Louis Amato-Gauci and Colleen Ma. And I really, I think this has been an interesting conversation because there has been a fair amount of confusion and trying to understand exactly what to do. Lou, I want to ask you about reciprocal tariffs and CUSMA compliance in a second. But let me just ask you a question. I'm a shareholder in Molson Coors. Molson Coors was a Canadian company, merged with Coors, became an American company, and is vertically integrated really across North America. Like I think lots of companies are. And in Etobicoke, they buy aluminum cans from Quebec. They put Canadian beer in it, and they ship it to the United States. Do they pay an aluminum tariff when it crosses the border? Or because it's beer, do they pay a beer tariff? Or because it, like, I don't know, what goes on? And if I buy a case of Molson and take it to the States, do I have to pay an aluminum tariff when I cross the border?
No, you don't. But certainly manufacturers on both sides of the border now are facing all sorts of changes here because of the introduction of these reciprocal tariffs. And what's worse is, to some extent, they're stackable. I can give you an example. And I like the one about the beer and the beer cans. Yes, I mean, aluminum and aluminum derivatives, such as beer cans, are subject to the steel and aluminum tariff. But
not when the beer's in it, only when they're empty?
Well, so there are some. Here's the whole point about all of this is that we've got 3 or 4 different types of tariffs, and then you have carve-outs in some cases, but not in others. So what that signals, I think, to the Canadian manufacturing folks out there is you need to understand what the rules are. The rules are changing rapidly. Make sure you've got the right advisors. Look at your products carefully. Make sure you've got the right classifications and see if, in fact, there are any carve-outs that may apply to you. The one that I'm most interested in at the moment is the issue of CUSMA.
Okay, so let me ask you about that, because I've had lots of people tell me that this CUSMA compliance is a huge opportunity, but a whole bunch of companies haven't really done the work to figure out whether they're CUSMA compliant and prove that they're CUSMA compliant, and that's a big opportunity. So tell me, what the blank is CUSMA compliant?
So first of all, free trade agreements generally will include rules, what we call rules of origin. Those rules of origin are product specific in some cases. At its most basic, if you're a potato farmer in Prince Edward Island, then you plant your seed, you've got a potato, that potato is produced in Canada. You can safely say it is CUSMA originating. It's a Canadian product and therefore eligible for preferential tariff treatment under CUSMA when it's sold to the United States or Mexico. When things get more complex in the manufacturing sector, where you've got lots of different inputs, and certainly as you go through the list of goods and increasing in levels of complexity, the rules become even more challenging to navigate. You will have a rule which could be what we call a tariff shift. So I start with an input which is in a particular chapter of the customs tariff, and my finished product is in a completely different chapter of the customs tariff. That would be what we call a tariff shift. Depending on the rule for that particular commodity, that may be enough for that good to qualify as CUSMA originating. Where it gets really complex is where you've got regional value content rules. And in the automotive sector in particular, it goes beyond regional value content now with the way that CUSMA was negotiated by Canada, the United States, and Mexico.
Best trade agreement ever.
100%. So the rules there for automotive are about as complex as they get. 75% of the value of the vehicle must originate in North America, Canada, US, or Mexico. That's true for passenger vehicles, light trucks, and core auto parts. In all other cases, it's 65 to 70%. So heavier vehicles, trucks, and so on, buses. 40 to 45% of the vehicle must be produced, the value of the vehicle must be produced by workers who earn at least $16 an hour. That's the new labor value content that was built in to CUSMA. And you can imagine that this was directed at Mexico in particular.
All or on average?
On average. 70% of the steel that's purchased by the OEM, by the vehicle manufacturer, must be North American. These are all very complex rules. Now,
Sounds pretty detailed.
Thankfully, for most manufacturers outside of the automotive sector, the rule will be a little bit simpler than that, but it is a commodity by commodity analysis. And that's why you've got to make sure you've got the right people sitting around that table with you, customs experts, lawyers who work in customs and trade, and accountants.
Sounds like this is going to be great for accountants and lawyers, and that's going to be an employment opportunity. My gosh, more red tape regulation, just what we need. Colleen, what Donald Trump keeps saying is that this is going to incentivize people to move manufacturing to the United States. Are some of your clients, Canadian companies, actually thinking about moving manufacturing or part of their manufacturing to the United States? And if they do so, what are some of the things they need to be thinking about?
Yeah, I don't think any option is really off the table right now. When someone is looking to move business operations to another country, the US or otherwise, one of the things to consider is, are you going to incorporate a subsidiary in the US? In the US, they also have different corporate structures. So in Canada, we have the limited liability corporate or limited corporation, or we have unlimited liability corporations. And then in the US, there are several different types of corporations that we don't see in Canada. So that's one thing that they would need to consider. Another thing to consider is, what is your tax rate going to be in the US, and how does that compare to Canada if you're considering moving manufacturing to the US or staying in Canada? Also, when you have a wholly owned subsidiary in the US, depending on the type of income they earn, if they're earning passive income or non-active business income, there is a rule that will deem that income earned by the US subsidiary to the Canadian subsidiary, even though there's no repatriation of those funds. It's a deeming rule. So that's another thing to think about and talk to your advisors on, and do not look at ChatGPT to try to understand those particular rules, because it scares the most seasoned tax practitioners. So those are some of the things to think about. There are also state taxes. What are those? How is that going to apply to you? There could be regulatory or licensing implications. That's a little bit outside my practice, but we could probably talk to. And those are some of the things to think about. The rules are different in the US. It's not like moving your manufacturing to Manitoba.
So one thing I would add to that, if I may, is transfer pricing, right? So this is another incredibly complex area of both tax and customs law for valuation for duty. If you are going to have operations on two sides of the border, so you've got an affiliate in the United States, presumably doing some or most of your manufacturing for the US market, and there are either physical inputs, parts, components going back and forth across the border, or management services, all of these things trigger the transfer pricing rules, both under income tax, Colleen, right? And also from our perspective, on the customs side for calculating your value for duty, they affect what type of valuation process you should be using in determining value for duty and assessing what is in fact payable to the United States or vice versa to Canada. Those are very complex questions. that do require expert advice.
Okay, so this may get a bit too technical, and you may not be able to answer, but let me ask you anyway. So on transfer pricing, I've been told that beer, as an example, often is imported into the United States at one cost because the intellectual property may be owned by a separate company in a different jurisdiction. And the example is used that Google, Apple, Heineken, a whole bunch of companies will own their intellectual property in Ireland, a low tax environment, and so therefore they'll produce the beer in wherever, and they'll ship it to the United States at one price, and they'll tack on a royalty that gets paid separately to a different jurisdiction. And I was told that that makes a lot of sense because the duty only applies to the manufactured product, not to the royalty on the intellectual property. Is that the case?
Yeah, so your value for duty is really looking at the valuation of the tangible good that is crossing the border. So if that tangible good, in your case of beer, doesn't include that intellectual property, then that value for that particular beer can is going to be less than if that good included all the intellectual property rights that went along with it. One thing to think about too is value for duty is a customs concept under one piece of legislation, and transfer pricing is an income tax concept under a completely different piece of legislation. And what value for duty does is look at your value of the tangible good that is crossing the border, whereas transfer pricing looks to see whether your agreements are consistent with an arm's length transaction. Are your fees, are your prices, are your terms and conditions similar to what you would expect an arm's length arrangement to be with an arm's length third party? The purpose of the value for duty rules is to calculate your duties or surcharges for tariffs. The reason we have transfer pricing is to avoid shifting income from a higher jurisdiction to a lower jurisdiction. So similar concepts, but very different purposes, different legislation, and different taxing authorities that are looking at them.
This is going to be unbelievably
though,
confusing. I really think this is going to be fantastic for your business and for a whole bunch of accountants and a whole bunch of tax advisors. And I'm not sure whether it's actually going to be beneficial for the U.S. government. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting with two incredibly smart lawyers from Miller Thomson tonight, Colleen Ma from the Calgary office and Louis Amato-Gauci from the Toronto office. They specialize in tariffs and trade and tax and legal advice. And I think they're going to be pretty damn busy over the course of the next couple of weeks as people try to figure out what the blank they're doing with Donald Trump's Rose Garden announcement. Louis, what do you think we've got to do? Give us a last smart comment about what everyone should be thinking about, please, sir.
Well, I would like for Canadian manufacturers to keep their eyes open for the opportunities that all of this uncertainty might present. They may not be immediately apparent, but keep in mind, Canada's got free trade agreements with 51 countries. We talked about this earlier. That's 1.5 billion consumers around the world. That's about 65% of the world's GDP. Secondly, this new reality of U.S. tariffs, all that it is doing, it's inflicting a lot of harm and pain on Canada, Mexico, and all around the world, for sure, but it is creating a tariff wall around the United States. American manufacturers are going to be looking for other places, friendly jurisdictions, where they may be able to manufacture their goods and get them to markets where currently they're going to be faced with the retaliatory tariffs being imposed by the European Union, by China, possibly down the road by Japan and Korea. Look to Canada. They will look to Canada as a possible venue, and those opportunities are there. You could enter into a contract with that U.S. manufacturer. There may be opportunities there for the sale of a business.
Colleen, final word to you. What do you think we should do?
I think no matter what the strategy that a business is looking into, make sure you stop, take a step back, and think, what else is this decision going to affect? Because hasty decisions can lead to, for example, tax efficiencies. And make sure you have the right team around the table. Have all the decision makers from all your departments, have all your advisors, all your specialists around the table at the same time in the same room. Might sound like a lot of people, but you'll be able to make better decisions faster. There's a lot of opportunity here for Canadian businesses.
Thank you both very much for joining. If I could close with a couple of my own thoughts, I think that business as usual is obviously not as usual, and we need to think about the changed world reality. I think that Louis, you're right that the United States might become a far more balkanized kind of environment, economy for the next couple of years. And so I think that we really need to think about how we do business with the rest of the world. And in my own case, I've got developers, construction companies that are looking for steel, HVAC from other locations, and we need to be thinking about how we diversify our sources. Excuse me, and our markets. That's our show for the night, everybody. Thank you for joining us.